No, we never had a situation where the world could be destroyed in 2 weeks or less. We're back to, in many ways, to the pre-Cold War era, where nation states are confronted by other nation states and by popular movements around the world. And until we make that decision or make that recognition, America can't defend itself. If you recall, when Mr. Baker and Mr. Hamilton published the Iraq Study Group report, it basically said, well, this is a problem, but it's a matter of management. We have to have more troops. The Europeans have to train more policemen. Mm-hmm. We have to teach people how to do taxation policy, as if we had all the time in the world and there wasn't an enemy out there. Right now, America confronts the world as if we are on one side of the tennis net. We hit the ball over, run around, and hit it back to ourselves. Another aspect of the Cold War thinking beyond time is proxies. Mm-hmm. When we supported proxies during the Cold War, whether it was the Afghan Mujahideen or Jonas Savimbi in Namibia, those men were in the field fighting without us. They were fighting for something they believed in. They were willing to spend their lives for it. That era is gone. Right now, we're looking for proxies, but we're trying to get people to do things for us that they wouldn't do off their own hook. I think Pakistan is the best example. Pakistan had no trouble with the Taliban, no trouble with bin Laden until they decided to help us. They're getting paid for it, absolutely. But they're not our proxies. They would not be doing this without our impetus behind them. And so I think we have to grow up a little. Mm-hmm. The age of proxies is over. If there's dirty work to do, we're going to have to do it ourselves.
This thing about proxies is very important because you talked to the case of General Zia, who basically we were using him as an instrument to arm the Mujahideen,
yes.
but in fact he had other interests, and you point to the fact that he wanted to distribute Korans in parts of the Soviet Union
yes.
in the Cold War. So there were really strong differences there about
Absolutely,
what was best
sir.
for him and what was best.
We had to pull the reins in on General Zia because he really did want to cause trouble in Soviet Central Asia. But even Zia, Zia was of the opinion that he could measure the level at which the Afghan pot boiled. Well, at the end of the day, all Pakistan did was distribute the arms and money and training that we provided, and the Afghans let us both because they were the ones that did the fighting. They were going to fight whether we gave them a nickel. Mm-hmm. That's not the case today. Basically, Pakistan is not a surrogate, it's a mercenary. Mm-hmm. It's not a proxy. It's doing something for some money, but it's not going to go to the point of wrecking their own country to do it. Mm-hmm. And I don't think we recognize that, sir.
You're also very critical of this notion that our elites have that somehow our notions of democracy can be made applicable to places like Iraq.
Yes.
Talk a little about that.
Well, and if you say something like that, if you say our notion of democracy doesn't fit in other places, you're immediately condemned or criticized as saying, well, you're saying Muslims are inferior people, that they can't do it. Well, that's not the case at all. They happen to have a religion that doesn't separate church and state. And until there is that separation, our secular democracy is irrelevant to them. It's worse than irrelevant. We say to Iraqis or to Afghans, adopt this system of government. Look what it has done for us in North America. We have a fairly equitable society. We're prosperous. We're peaceful, all of which is very true. But what they hear is turn your back on God and accept these man-made ways. And I think we don't appreciate that. In many ways, the least exportable commodity America has is its democracy.
I sense in reading your book that on the one hand you're a very impassioned American nationalist. Basically, that you've read the history, you know the history. Some of your quotes I found quite remarkable, and you're a real defender of our ideals. On the other hand, you've been a practitioner of realpolitik in some indirect way as an officer of the CIA, and I'm just curious how you reconcile these two things in your own mind. And the case in point would be the rendition program. basically? Because I know you, in leading that program, and we should explain to our audience, explain to our audience what the rendition program was and how it came about.
The rendition program began in the middle to late year of 1995. We had begun to discover Al Qaeda and other groups that were much more powerful and dispersed than we had thought. Mr. Lake, then the National Security Advisor, the President, Mr. Clinton, and Mr. Berger ordered the CIA to begin to dismantle Al Qaeda cells around the world. And we said, yes, we're the President's service organization. What do you want to do with these people? And they said, that's up to you. And we said, no, you don't get it. We don't have, at that time, we didn't have prisons. So what they said was to take these people to countries where they were wanted for a legal process.
Where they were, I'm sorry, say.
Where they were wanted for a legal process.
In other words, they were wanted individuals. They were outlaws. Yeah, right.
There was a warrant for them, or they had been convicted in absentia.
Okay.
They were terrorists or other kinds of criminals, which in many ways limited our ability to operate against Al Qaeda because there was only a limited number of that species out there.
Okay.
But under Mr. Clinton, we were to take them off the street and arrange for them to be returned to the government that wanted them for a judicial process. The goals of the program, very simply at the start, were two things. First, to get people off the street who were either involved in attacks against America or were planning attacks, or our allies. And the second thing was to get from them at the time of their capture whatever paper or electronic documents they had at the time on them, because they never expected the Americans to read those. Mm-hmm. There was no plan really at all to interrogate them, primarily because Al Qaeda trains its people to be very tough to interrogate. They either fabricate information or they give you a lot of information that's accurate, but you spend your time running it down and it doesn't lead you anywhere because it's dated. But that was the goal of the program until Mr. Bush came in, and then we began holding people ourselves.
Okay, and the initial program was signed off by President Clinton or by his national security?
No, it was signed off by the president. There's no program that's described as covert action that can be conducted by the agency without the president's approval, and with the approval of both intelligence committees in the House, the Senate, and the Congress. All of those people seem to have forgotten that they approved this at the time, but nonetheless, that's the way the system works. The CIA is peculiarly the instrument of the President of the United States, whether he's a Republican or a Democrat, sir.
So but let's be clear about this. So in the initial form, when you were involved, there really was no interrogation of the prisoners. They were just seized, basically, and then turned over to the Egyptians. But we must have suspected that the Egyptians or whoever might wind up torturing these people.
Sure. And we went back to the White House and we said, listen, this is what we plan to do. Do you want us to do it? Yes, was the answer. Okay, well, we're going to take them to countries where they're wanted, but your State Department every year is going to say that country is a human rights abuser or its judicial processes are not what we want them to be. And everybody kind of puckered up and said, oh, that may be a problem. And they said, well, can you get these countries to say we will treat these rendered people according to our own laws?
I see.
And we said, yeah, we're pretty sure that country X will treat them according, but that doesn't get you off the hook.
Yeah.
But that's as far as it went. Now, President Clinton and Mr. Berger have said that they insisted on guarantees that these prisoners would be treated according to American standards or international law. Now, I was there, I ran the operations. That was never a requirement that I knew of. That's entirely a kind of after-the-fact defense of what was done.
Now, this raises an interesting question, which is how programs morph into something else. And what I want to get at is I find you in your work a very strong defender of what we're about, basically, the ideals of due process, of liberty, of what our founding fathers were about. But in this world of international politics, we wind up doing things. And I want to ask you what you see as the way that things that we do abroad come back to haunt us and change who we are.